Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University.
Hi, friends. Welcome to Civics in a Year Kids Edition. I am very excited because today it is not just me in Kids Edition. I have my friend, Dr. Kirsten Burkhog, who knows a lot about the women of the founding. And so today we're going to talk about the women that were important in the founding era. So, Dr. Burkhog, we're going to start with Martha Washington. Can you tell me, I know our young friends probably know Martha and George Washington, but can you tell me about Martha Washington and why she was important to the founding of our nation?
So Martha Washington, you guys probably know, is the wife of our first president, George Washington. But what a lot of people don't know about Martha Washington is that while George Washington was a general in the American Revolution, she actually traveled around to all of his different military encampments with him. So you may have heard of Valley Forge, which is this valley that got really cold during the American Revolution. In the winter, George Washington was there. They ran out of food. They had to start eating their horses. What a lot of people don't know is that Martha Washington was there with them. So she's really important as a support for someone who was under a great amount of pressure and is a seriously important person in our nation's founding. And because she was able to be this supportive figure for him, it meant that he was able to be the person that we now know as the father of our country.
And on that then, our second president was John Adams, and his wife, Abigail Adams, was also really important in our founding. Can you tell me a little bit about Abigail?
Abigail is a little bit different than Martha, if only because they had different marriages that required different things. So John Adams, unlike George Washington, was not a soldier. So during the American Revolution and the founding, he's primarily a lawyer and a politician. Now that does mean he has to be gone from home a lot. They had a family farm in Braintree, Massachusetts, and Abigail Adams ran the family farm. She took care of all of their children, all of their livestock, all of their crops. She was responsible for firing and hiring farm hands, for selling and buying supplies for the farm. And as a result, she is this really interesting model for a kind of different sort of marriage than what we see in George Washington and Martha Washington. She also is this really interestingly politically minded woman. John Adams often writes to Abigail and asks for her opinion on political matters, and when she sends her opinion back, we can see a lot of those conversations getting reflected in the sorts of things John Adams is presenting to other politicians. So early on, she is a woman in American history who is engaged with politics indirectly because she can't have a voice herself, but through her husband is able to influence politics in some pretty important ways.
And then John Adams also had a really good friend named Mercy Otis Warren. Can you tell us a little bit about her?
John Adams actually wrote to Mercy Otis Warren that he thought she was definitely smarter than him, at least once or twice. A little tidbit. Mercy Otis Warren was a great friend of the Adams family. She was both friends with Abigail and John. And she was also married to a general in the American Revolution. She was a mom of 5. And during the American Revolution, she started writing. She started writing poems and plays and essays. She had lots of ideas, and she was a really good writer. And she kind of got discovered and started publishing a bunch of stuff during the time of the American Revolution and long after the founding. So one of the things that Mercy Otis Warren did that was really important is that during the constitutional ratification conventions. So we have a document, a proposal for the Constitution. We give it to the states for them to decide if they're going to say they like it or not. She wrote this essay with some arguments about why the Constitution could be improved or how the Constitution could be improved. And one of the things that she said was that this Constitution needed a Bill of Rights. It needed to say what the explicit rights were of Americans, what government was not allowed to do or infringe upon. And this essay was so important and influential that the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution during the ratification conventions. So this is a really important moment in American history. We don't really know what the Constitution would look like without the Bill of Rights. And in fact, it might not have passed. So she's a really, really important and pivotal figure.
Speaking of writers, there's another important writer during this time named Judith Sargent Murray. Can you tell us a little bit about her and her writings?
Judith Sargent Murray comes a little bit later. So she is after the American Revolution, after the founding, and she starts writing these essays about how she believes men and women should have equal political rights. And those sorts of essays were necessary because at this time, women did not have a right to vote. They didn't have rights to participate in politics in the same way that men did. So Judith Sargent Murray starts writing arguments about why men and women deserve to have equal political rights. And her main argument is just basically that men and women are equally capable of being good people and good citizens. And because they're equally capable of being good citizens, that means that they should both have a say in politics. So she's writing about this very early. Women wouldn't have the right to vote for at least another 100 years after she started writing, but she's one of the first voices in American history that starts to say that, hey, this all men are created equal thing, this could apply to women too.
And another first, we have recently learned in our podcast about a poet named Phillis Wheatley. So Phillis Wheatley, tell us what is important about her and how she was really influential during this time.
So an important thing to remember about Phillis Wheatley is that unlike all of the other people that we've talked about so far, Phillis Wheatley was enslaved. She was not a free person. She came to the United States in 1761 when she was just 6 or 7 years old on a slaver ship and was sold into slavery. And throughout the course of her enslavement, it turns out that she demonstrated this really powerful ability to write poetry. So she wrote a ton of poetry celebrating people's lives and death in the Boston area, and then also dealing with the political complications of the American Revolution. She additionally dealt a little bit and in really subtle and careful ways with these big questions about what it means to be a person who is not free, while the American Revolution is all about freedom. So, of course, you guys know that the Civil War eventually would end slavery, but here we have someone writing from the perspective of an enslaved person about how these ideals of American liberty don't exactly jive with what we think of in terms of this, institution of slavery. So down the road later on, you would see people like Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass make really similar arguments that the American founding makes promises of freedom that aren't kept to enslaved people. And we see Phillis Wheatley making those exact same kind of arguments early on during the very revolution itself.
And she wrote a poem about George Washington, right?
She did write a poem about George Washington. Phillis Wheatley deeply admired George Washington, and she wrote a poem about him as a military and political leader that he, in fact, read and he had great admiration for, and he wrote her back personally and said, "I love this poem. Thank you so much for writing it for me," which is a kind of amazing thing that, right? George Washington, the father of our country, writes a letter to a woman in Boston who is enslaved and thanks her for writing on his behalf.
And then the last lady we want to talk about today did something a little bit different. Can you tell us a little bit about Deborah Sampson?
Deborah Sampson is so cool. Deborah Sampson is, to our knowledge, the only female veteran of the American Revolution. And she's the only female veteran of the American Revolution because women were not allowed to serve in the military during the American Revolution. So she, in fact, disguised herself as a man. She took on a completely different name and for several years served in the military during the Revolution, living as a man. And not only did she serve, but she had really important jobs. She wasn't just a soldier, she was a spy too. She led a bunch of different raids on British troops. And in order to keep her secret, she got injured several times. In fact, people often got injured during battles. For fighting in close quarters, she usually tended to all of her own wounds. And at one point, she took a musket ball to her thigh. She removed it herself to make sure that no one realized that she was, in fact, a woman. So eventually she falls ill and she is discovered to be a woman, but nonetheless, she's honorably discharged from the U.S. military and is considered a honored veteran of the American Revolution. There would be, in the years after the Revolution, there would be retellings and panels of Revolutionary War veterans, and she would always show up to them in full uniform, fully ready to just tell all of the most theatrical stories of hers from the Revolution. So she's a really fascinating figure, and her husband ended up being the very first person to receive payment from the United States government for being a spouse of a veteran, which is an interesting little side note of history.
All of these women sound so cool. And, we've only talked about a couple, and I'm sure that especially in the revolutionary times, there was a lot more women to talk about, but we kind of wanted to start here. Dr. Berghag, thank you so much for sharing these wonderful women with our young viewers. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.